The Lord give you peace. Father David Mary here. We're back again. I'm going to talk about the name of the Friars Minor, the name of the order, how they come to be called the Order of Friars Minor. They originally called themselves Penitents from Assisi. When they were introduced to the Holy Father in Rome, the first time in 1209, they were announced as Penitents from Assisi. And Francis described the beginnings of his own religious life as being given the grace to do penance. And remember, Francis had been part of that group, the Order of Penitents, who were out doing penance for their past sins. And so they kind of grouped themselves together and called themselves Penitents from Assisi. And that name was only used in the very early first days. It had no historical development. So they did recognize themselves as a special group within the church and called to a special mission. And so Penitents from Assisi didn't exactly capture what they were trying to express about themselves. So the next name they picked up was Friars Minores, or Poor Minors. But this began to excite a bit of pride within the brothers. You know, hey, we're the poor lesser guys. You know, we're the poor minors. We're the poor humble guys. And it kind of got to a bit of a boasting. And so Francis thought that was not good, so he dropped it real quick. He didn't want the name to excite pride in the brothers. Now, all other early outside sources will call them Fratres Minores, or Friars Minor, lesser brothers. They were sometimes referred to as the Order of Preachers. Now, this name became exclusive to the Dominicans, but before St. Dominic and the Friars picked up that name, various people were calling the friars friar preachers. James of Vitry, he says this. He says, "This is the religion of the truly poor ones of the crucified, and the order of preachers whom we call Friars Minor." Notice what he says there. He says, this is the religion of the truly poor ones, okay, so those who live in poverty, or of the crucified. And so we see the early Franciscan devotion to the crucifix, to the crucifixion, to Christ crucified, that really identified the friars. You know, they were identified with Christ crucified and with the poverty of Christ. And then they were called the Order of Preachers, you know, who were out there preaching the gospel. And their other name is the Friars Minor. So we see there's a little confusion with the name. Now, Dominicans will pick up that name as their title of their order, but it was already being Friars Minor, already being nicknamed the Order of Preachers before that. Now, let's look at that word minore. In Francis's day, there was the maggiore and the minore. The maggiore, the majors, referred to the feudal lords and the nobility. It was for those who held power, wealth, and prestige. So the maggiore in the society were the noble lords who held power, wealth, and prestige. And then the society had the minore, the minors. They were referred to the underclass. The term was used for the poor, those who were in the service of others. They were the lesser serving the other, the greater. And so in the Mirror of Perfection, we see that there is this account of a conversation between the Father and the Son regarding the order's conception and name. And there's that sense where God the Son, not the sense, Francis sees God the Son asking the Father for a group of lesser brothers who would observe the gospel and would renew the gospel life. And it's granted to him. Francis and the brothers are granted to him. So Francis will say that the name was revealed to him and that the name was given to them by Christ himself. And you can read that in 1 Celano 38, A Mirror of Perfection, paragraph 26. Now, in the rule of 1223, it writes, "Let them be lesser brothers." Lesser brothers. Francis says, "I wish this fraternity to be called the Order of Friars Minor." And we see in Celano, he says, "And indeed they were lesser brothers who were being subject to all, always sought out a place that was lowly and sought to perform a duty that was seemed in no way to be burdensome to them, so that they might merit to be found solidly in true humility, and that through their fruitful disposition, a spiritual structure of all virtues might arise in them." So that word minority for Francis was more than just association with the poor. Absolutely, it was an association with the poor, but it was also a spiritual foundation upon which all the other virtues could be built. If the friars truly saw themselves as minors, as servants to the rest of the world, and lived in that humility and that charity which comes with it, then the rest of the virtues would be built upon it, always preferring the lowest place. Now later in the Mirror of Perfection it says, the vocation teaches them to remain humble and to follow in the footsteps of Christ's humility, so that by this means they may at least be exalted above others in the eyes of the saints. So they want the saints to exalt them by seeing their humility. They don't want the world to exalt them. They want to be at the service of the world, but they want the saints to exalt them by seeing their humility. And so that name was to excite them, the Friar Minor, was to excite the friars to truly follow after the humbleness and the humility of Christ himself. And so we see in the Mirror of Perfection, it says, it was revealed by God that his brothers should call themselves minors. So Francis really believed that this name was not something he just pulled out of a hat. This was a name bestowed upon them, given to them by Christ himself when he requested it of his Father, that he have a group of poor minors, lesser brothers, who would live the gospel, that name, lesser brothers, was given. So Francis, in the beginning, struggling to find a name, found his name not by thinking it through, but by a gift. By a gift from God, the name Friar Minor was given to the order. Okay? Now let's look at the spiritual basis for this name. We look at Matthew 5, verses 3 to 12, the Beatitudes. What are the Beatitudes but an expression of minority, particularly blessed are the poor in spirit and blessed are the meek? Matthew 11:25, Jesus praises the Father because he has revealed himself to the poor and the meek. In Matthew 18, verses 1 through 4, who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven but the least, right? Matthew 19, 13 to 15, the blessing of the children. But Jesus again exalts humility. Matthew 19:30, the rich young man. He's told to go and sell all he has, give to the poor, come follow Christ. He's called to minority. He's called to poverty. Matthew 10, Mark 10, verses 42 to 45. We see the ambition of James and John, again, we should be the greatest, must be the least. Luke 10, verses 17 to 20, the return of the 72. Jesus again praises humility. Luke 14, 7 to 14, the conduct of the invited guests, that you take the lowest place. You take the lowest place. In Luke 17, verses 7 to 10, the attitude of a servant that we're supposed to have. Luke 18, 9 through 4, 15 to 17, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee is in the front, praising himself, and the tax collector is in the back, beating his breast. Luke 22, 24 to 30, the role of discipleship, the importance of being the least. And then we see John 12, 23 to 26, the coming of Jesus' hour, and the call again to love one another in servitude. John 13, 1 through 20, the washing of the disciples' feet. This is fundamental for understanding the Franciscan charism of minority, that we are to be the foot washers of one another and of the whole world. Jesus Christ strips himself down to his, the inner tunic, gets on his hands and knees, and he washes the feet of the apostles. And Jesus says, you call me Lord and Master, for so indeed I am. And if I, your Lord and Master, wash your feet, you must wash one another's feet. And so this is with something only a slave would do. And this is the life of a Friar Minor, is to imitate that service of Jesus, who would wash the feet of his disciples. And St. Francis found this gospel passage to be so important for the brothers that he had it read before his death. He wanted to leave it as a memorial to the brothers of how we are to love one another and how we are to love the world, how we are to identify with our charism of being the foot washers of the world. Now let's take a look at some of the early changes in the order. First modifications dealt with the residences and the institutions of provinces. Let me back up a little bit and just say, I think I last talked about the friars only being 12. Well, the order began to grow rapidly, greatly. It had this incredible expansion when people saw these 12 men living after the manner of the Holy Gospel, living the radicality of their life, living a deep life of prayer, living a life of fraternity and joy and service of others, that focus on the passion of Christ, the humility of God, living this life of total dependence upon the Lord. It just drew vocations. People came out of the woodwork. And the order began to grow very, very fast. The Franciscan order remains the fastest growing order in the history of the church. to go from 12 to thousands at the time of Francis's death in less than 20-year period. Amazing. And so, France, the changes had to happen as the order began to grow. And so there were certain modifications that were made as the order grew. First of all, with residences, where they lived, how they lived. They had to start, dividing the guys up into provinces. There were so many guys. France had to devise a way to be able to maintain the rule of authority over large spans of territory and various houses, and friars being able to be transferred from one house to another. Unlike the old monastic community, you entered a monastery and boom, that was it, you're part of the monastery. In order to maintain poverty, Francis wanted the houses to be small. And so when you get to 12, you move on to another house, 12 to another house. And the order would grow in multitude of houses throughout the entirety of Christendom. So they also learned how to pray the divine office. That was a very important change, of how to move from praying the Our Fathers to praying the divine office. And then also rules on fasting and so forth. So in the residences, in 1213, now we're looking 4 years ahead of Francis founding the order. We'll go back a little later. We'll go back to the early years. But in 1213, the friars began to accept permanent residences, and in 1213 is when Francis accepted Livorno. Now, when I say permanent residence, the friar not being there forever, that would be someplace, a stable location, that this is our friary in this territory. We don't own the friary, it doesn't belong to us, but that's our friary, in the sense the friars are living there in perpetuity. And Livorno was one of those examples. This great mountain where Francis put up a friary up on this mountain, and that mountain was given to him by Count Orlando. Count Orlando still owned it, but it was for the exclusive use of the friars. So the friars began to settle in definitive localities outside cities or towns, most often near a chapel or oratory. Now, it's interesting, the friars went outside the town, not just to be among the poor, but so that they could have a place of contemplation. We call these today the hermitage friaries. Not that they were hermits, but it was outside the city where the friars can give themselves over to prayer and contemplation, go out back to the city to beg and preach or serve the poor, and come back to the friary. Okay? So in no way did they resemble monasteries. They weren't called a friary, but a loca, or a hospice. So it didn't have the name friary yet, It was called a locality, or hospice. So the places were made of mud and branches, so no fancy stuff, no fancy bricks, no fancy things. The rule of 1221 forbid them to claim ownership of any place or try to hold property against somebody else. And they were not allowed to take money as alms for their houses or for their dwelling places. So there was a strict rule on this, poverty of the places they had. Now, the provinces and provincials, as the order began to grow up until 1217, the general chapter had to send out to the four corners of the world, even to the infidels. The order was just growing everywhere, so far as being sent out to the four corners of the world, even into Muslim territory. So Francis established provinces in that he appointed friars to regions in which they were to live and work from then on under the direction of a minister of superior of that region. So Francis begins to develop the whole system that we have today of religious life and how it should be governed. So you have the minister general, who has his council with him, who are elected from among the brothers, and then you have the different territories of the world. Each territory is governed by a provincial. That provincial is elected by the brothers of that territory, and those provincials elect the minister general. So you have the general who goes out to each of the provincials. Each of the provincials have the friars under their territory. So you kind of create this web over the earth of the friars. And this program of what you call authority, or this process of leadership, becomes the model for the church. So Francis is somewhat another gift he makes to the church. Okay, so the name of a province came from the name of the country or city where the main house was located. So if the main house was located in Paris, well, it was the Friars of Paris, It could cover all of France, but Paris was the mother house, or Oxford in England, or Cologne in Germany, So the name of the province came from wherever the mother house was in that territory. And that kind of fluctuated depending upon, what was going on in the territory and the times. As the friars multiplied, Those which were nearest each other were assembled under the direction of a particular superior who was dependent upon the superior of the province. And so if you had a group of friaries in a particular area, they were grouped together under a superior of what was then called a province. At first it was called a custody, and then the number of friars grew, and friaries were growing constantly. That friary would become a province and having its own particular superior. Superiors of houses or custodies or provinces were called ministers or custodians. Isn't that interesting? You know, Francis didn't use the word superior or prior or abbot. He used the word servant or custos or guardian. Now, in the early documents, all these names are interchangeable. Eventually, they'll be clarified. But later years, each had a specific meaning. The provincial superior was called the provincial minister. He was the servant of that province. His job was to serve the brothers of that territory. Superior of a custody was called the custos, or the custodian. His job was to be the custodian of that particular custody. The superior of friary was called the guardian because he was to guard the life of the brothers in that friary. The rule of 1221, the title minister, refers to all the superiors. All the superiors were to be ministers, servants of the brothers. And the head of the entire order is called the general minister, or general servant. Not that he had stars on his shoulder as if he was a general, but general meaning he was the servant of all the brothers. There wasn't one brother to which he was not the servant to. So Francis's idea in establishing an authority structure was to establish an authority structure based upon servitude, based upon the gospel, that those in authority are not to lord it over the brothers, but they are to be truly servants of the rest of the brothers. Originally, anyone could be elected a superior, a cleric or a lay brother, and the provincial had the right to give the habit, in other words, accepting people, assign each friar to a house, correct friars, assign preachers. No office were to be permanent, so you couldn't be a superior forever. It was never meant to be permanent. You served your time, and then you go back to being one of the brothers. It stopped people from getting power hungry. And you must always be ready to give that office away. So the friars were obliged to examine the behavior of the minister, and if they found him reprehensible, they were to denounce him with 3 warnings to change. And so, the brothers had the right to call the brother in charge to conversion. Okay? The 1221 rule did not give a way of nominating, so the provincials were appointed by St. Francis himself. Later they became elected, but originally Francis appointed the superiors. The names of the superiors were essential to the mind of St. Francis. As I mentioned, unlike the monastic orders, he wanted the superiors always to remember what and who they are to the other friars, servants. So once again, we see St. Francis applying the gospel command of superiors being the servants of the rest into the very structure of the community. Now, we're going to carry on in the next section here about capitular meetings, or general chapter meetings, and how they affect the life of the brothers. So we'll catch that up on the next one, and then class, and then we'll talk about the expansion of the order, and we'll turn back to our program at 12:12 and go back on to our chronology of Francis's life. May God bless you, and Mary keep you.